Hi everyone! In today's demo, we're going to talk about how to get started with your watercolor painting. So first off, make sure that you grab your small sample of paper, your media study paper, paper towel, a cup of water, your watercolor palette, and your brushes. So to get started, we're going to look at, on that little tiny strip of paper, some different ways of working with watercolor. So the first method, as you can see here, is called wet on wet. So what that means is that you're actually going to wet your paper first, and then you take wet watercolor and add it to the surface. You'll notice that what happens is that it creates this really cool bleeding effect where the color just kind of bleeds out. Another way of working is you take that same watercolor and it's called a wet on dry. So that means the watercolor is wet, but the paper is dry. So as you can see here, as I let the paint sit just a little bit, I dropped in a few touches of yellow. And what happens is, as long as that color is still wet, it'll create sort of that bleeding effect. All right, so this next section that I'm working here is I am really trying to work with a dry brush with more of the watercolor being mostly dry. So you'll notice that I am constantly dabbing my brush with paper towel because I really want to make sure my brush is nice and dry, and it's going to create sort of this rough, jagged texture. So those are kind of the three main ways of working. You can also use blotting. So to blot, you're going to just take that paper towel and gently dab it to soak up some of that water. So when you're getting started, the first thing that you want to do is you want to actually draw out your subject. So mine, for example, is this giraffe, and you want to break it down into different shapes. Next, what you want to do is make sure that all of the colors that you want to use are nice and wet. Make sure that you are cleaning your brush regularly so you don't muddy any of your colors. Okay, so to get started, as you can see here, I'm using that wet on wet technique. So I am making my whole area, or that whole shape, wet first. So as you can see, I went around the edges first in order, and then filled in the center. I'm working with a round brush because I find it's a little bit easier to create rounded edges or follow curves and things like that. So I'm just filling in and really letting the watercolor disperse on its own. So as you can see on this one, I decided to try out working with the wet watercolor on the dry paper, which is wet on dry, which is kind of our normal way of working. I just wanted to see and practice that different style and add a little bit more of that orangey color into it. So as you're working, before you add layers to your colors, you really want to make sure that each section is finished drying until you go back over it. So the reason for that is you want to be able to build up your layers. As you can see here, my color was a little too dark, so I'm actually using the blotting technique and just gently pulling up some of that color so the water's not as thick, and I'm able to keep my layers kind of thin and light. So I'm just pulling a little bit more of that water out of there and just finishing up the top of the other tuft of my giraffe.